Just after noon on Thursday, May 14th of 2020, the 72-year-old Long Island man, Dwight Powers, was participating in a Zoom call with around 20 other people. They were all part of the local chapter of Alcoholics Anonymous and, like millions of other people during the pandemic, were attempting an old system around new and frightening conditions. It wasn't like Dwight to miss a meeting. His long-held sobriety was precious to him, and his own slight technophobia wasn't going to stand in the way of that. Dwight sat at his computer in the small office he put together at his home on Dixon Avenue in Amityville, and warmly chatted with those in attendance before they noticed something moving in the background of Dwight's video feed. To their horror, they saw a figure walk into the room, slowly approaching Dwight from behind. Given that he was concentrating on the conversation unfolding on screen, Dwight was completely unaware that anyone was creeping up on him, and the first he knew of the intruder's presence was when they began viciously beating him about the face and neck. Other users in the call gasped as they saw such a cruel display of violence unfold before their very eyes, inflicted by a man who turned out to be completely naked. When the figure finished hitting Dwight and turned to leave the room, other callers asked if he was okay, but Dwight could barely respond. He was bleeding from a busted lip, and the sheer speed and intensity of the ambush had clearly shaken him. But to his viewers' horror, the attack wasn't over. The figure returned to the room holding something in each of his hands, things that glinted in the light of an overhead lamp, and in full view of almost 20 other Zoom callers, began stabbing Dwight in the back and side, over and over and over again. Those watching could do nothing but call 911 as they watched Dwight gargle blood before falling off of his chair. But even this was a fruitless task, since no one actually knew Dwight's home address. When Dwight fell, his attacker went down with him, plunging the large kitchen knives into Dwight's fallen body in a frenzied and bloody assault, until all people could hear over his computer's microphone were his dying breaths. The callers managed to give a vividly detailed description of Dwight's attacker, thanks to the quality of his computer webcam. But when the police honed in on a man fitting that description, who also happened to have Dwight's blood all over his change of clothes, they discovered something horrifying. That Dwight Powers' murderer was none other than 32-year-old Thomas Scully Powers, Dwight's own son. In a statement given to homicide detectives shortly after his arrest, Thomas Scully Powers admitted stabbing his own father around 20 to 25 times. He told them he returned to the kitchen at one point to change knives because the smaller, cheaper blades kept bending whenever they struck bone, and to fully decapitate his own father in a horrendous, unprovoked attack. Thomas had to use a bread knife to saw through the dense bone and cartilage of his father's spine. Suffolk County District Attorney Tim Seeney said, "This is a shocking and disturbing case. By the defendant's own admission, he brutally stabbed his own father repeatedly until he was certain he was dead. The investigation into this horrific murder is still ongoing, but rest assured we will obtain justice for the victim." Shockingly, when Thomas Scully Powers was charged with murder and appeared before a judge via video link to enter a plea, he insisted he was not guilty by reason of insanity. However, a psychiatric exam showed Thomas to be quite lucid, and in light of this, the judge ordered that he be held at the Riverhead Correctional Facility without bail, and that a maximum sentence of 25 years to life should be handed down should Thomas be found guilty. In the run-up to the trial, Thomas's defense attorney insisted that he would be exploring Mr. Powers' mental health and capacity in relation to this incident. It seemed obvious that they would be playing the insanity card, as I'm sure neither they nor the general public could comprehend any sane reason why a man would just murder his own father out of the blue. The prosecution argued that Thomas had murdered his father when he was completely lucid, owing to the fact that he tried to flee the scene when the cops arrived. He knew what he had done was wrong, and had attempted to hide the evidence of his crime by mopping up the blood and disposing of a bloody bedsheet in a trash bag. On top of that, when the cops arrived at the assisted living facility that Dwight Powers called home, his son tried to escape arrest by jumping out of a second-floor window. Despite being injured in the fall, Thomas ran across a busy highway and into a corner store where he attempted to use Dr. Pepper, of all things, to wash the blood from his clothes. Obviously, he was quickly spotted by the store's owner, who called in the police officers that arrested Thomas shortly afterward. In a statement to local media outlets, Suffolk County Police Department said that although they had yet to determine a motive for the stabbing, they could safely rule out any tensions stemming from father and son being quarantined together. Prosecuting attorneys were also confounded by the killing, saying Thomas had mentioned during his police interview that his father had tried to slit his wrist with a knife, but they had a physical inspection that revealed what they characterized as only a slight mark on Thomas's wrist, and dismissed the claim of self-defense as a flimsy attempt to mask a markedly darker motive. Two neighbors of Dwight Powers, Steve and Mary Englert, said they have been close friends of his family for the majority of the 40 years they'd spent living side by side. They said he was very close to his family, but although he undoubtedly had a lot of love for Thomas, Dwight seldom talked about his wayward son. With a euphemism that seemed to hide something much more sinister, Mary Englert told reporters that Thomas had struggles and would move in with his father during tough stretches. Dwight never hesitated to take Thomas back in, with Steve and Mary testifying that Dwight was a very devoted father. When his sons needed him, he was there, Mary told reporters with a glint of melancholy in her eye. As it turned out, Mary actually grew up with Dwight in the small town of Levittown, New York State, and said that he had been absolutely horrified to hear of her beloved neighbor's untimely death. At first, she simply refused to believe it was true, insisting it must have been some terrible mix-up, although the Englerts had been unable to call over at Dwight's house due to the pandemic. They made a point of calling him on his cell phone to wish him a happy birthday, which had only been a few weeks prior. "How could we have known that was the last time we'd ever talked to him?" Mary said. "It just didn't seem real that he was gone. Dwight loved his family so much. They were everything to him. I just can't imagine why it all happened." By all accounts, Dwight Powers was a stand-up guy. He had served as a rifleman in the United States Marine Corps and had a tour of Vietnam under his belt. When Dwight left the Marines, he got himself a job as a customs agent, opting for a quiet life in the suburbs where he could keep his family safe and happy. Folks said there wasn't a darn chance he had skeletons in his closet. He was just too much of a goof. He was 50 years old when he joined a rock band that played charity shows for children's foundations. Then when he was 60, Dwight grew a passion for the environment and began volunteering with Habitat for Humanity. When he wasn't making the world a better place, he could often be found watching reruns of The Three Stooges, laughing his butt off at wholesome slapstick humor. There have been plenty of suggestions that Dwight wasn't the family man he made himself out to be, and that a dark and sordid history of patriarchal abuse led to Thomas lashing out in some kind of psychotic frenzy. But every attempt to paint Dwight as some kind of abusive, smiling sociopath has either been based on circumstantial evidence or downright lies. But the question remains, will we ever find concrete evidence or testimony of Dwight's secret abuses? Or was a good man just unlucky enough to have a son who was violently and criminally deranged? Maybe people just want to find a rational excuse as to why a young man would murder his own loving father while completely in the buff. Because there's nothing scarier than the idea that we live in a world where those we shower with love, support, and affection can just snap one day, leaving us choking in a pool of our own blood, with a digital audience just having watched us die. On the morning of August 12, 2020, the young daughter of 32-year-old Maribel Rosada Morales was logging onto her computer for her first day of Zoom classes. Her home state of Florida had been one of the hardest hit by the pandemic, and like many of her Warfield Elementary School classmates, the closure of her school meant she was forced to participate in one of the great educational experiments of our time, one in which millions of children all over the world would be educated remotely using a piece of conference call software called Zoom. This new ad hoc method proved to have its fair share of problems, and scores of teachers reported difficulties in remote education almost immediately. But the teacher that morning must have had no idea what kind of horror she was about to face, a horror she would be unable to hide from young, innocent eyes. Around 8 a.m., the 10-year-old student was taking part in a roll call with around 30 other children when her teacher began to hear something in the background of her audio. It sounded like voices, hushed but strained, and as the minutes passed, the voices coming from the feed of Maribel Morales' daughter grew louder and louder. It got to the point where a full-on argument seemed to be breaking out in the home, and by the time profanity began to be used, the teacher realized that some kind of potentially violent domestic altercation was on hand. Then, the teacher, along with 30 other young children, watched in horror as the young Morales' girl looked off camera, then quickly covered her ears with a terrified look on her face. A series of loud pops could be heard, sounding strange and tinny when picked up by the laptop's cheap microphone. Many of the children asked what they were, but their teacher knew, and she was quick to mute the girls' mics so they couldn't hear what came next. The last the teacher and class saw of Maribel Morales' daughter was just before her screen suddenly went black, as a bullet fired from a 9mm handgun smashed into the computer's motherboard. Police officers responding to the teacher's 911 call arrived at the Morales' residence just minutes later, but they were too late. Lying on the floor, surrounded by screaming, terrified children, Maribel Rosado Morales had been shot to death in front of 4 of her own kids and 2 young cousins by a man who had apparently fled the scene on a stolen bicycle. Just a few hours later, police received a phone call from a city bus driver saying he and his passengers had been taken hostage by a man armed with a pistol. The man had ordered the driver to take him to a destination off of the bus's route and was in the process of subduing and intimidating the bus's many passengers, thus giving him an opportunity to call. He didn't seem to have made any demands, but he was armed and extremely agitated. It was a painfully volatile situation, but by some insane stroke of luck, a police SWAT team happened to be on a training exercise in the general vicinity. Once the bus was cornered, they stormed the vehicle and subdued the hostage-taker without a shot being fired. As he was being cuffed, the hostage-taker made a shocking confession. He told the heavily armed policeman that his name was Donald Williams and that he had shot and killed his ex-girlfriend just a few hours before. And as it turned out, his ex-girlfriend was none other than 32-year-old Maribel Rosado Morales. Donald was subsequently charged with first-degree murder as well as several other felony charges, including being a convicted felon in possession of a gun. The local sheriff's department said that he would also be charged with armed burglary and armed home invasion, and that there would obviously be additional penalties due to the presence of children during such a horrific killing. In the aftermath, the Florida Department of Children and Families was faced with the heartbreaking task of finding new homes for poor children who had been orphaned during the attack, who were all between the ages of 10 to 17. The shooting rocked the local community, especially given that some of their own children had witnessed a life being taken, all thanks to advances in communications technology. Warfield Elementary and the Martin County School District released a statement saying, "Our deepest sympathies and condolences go out to the victim's family, including children present in the home who were witnesses to this heartbreaking and senseless tragedy. We have our grief team deployed to assist students and staff who will undoubtedly feel the impact of this horrible incident. We stand ready to assist and offer support in any way we can." But no amount of grief counseling will really put a dent into the immense trauma suffered by so many children that morning, not to mention their teacher, who for a few grim moments must have thought that she'd witnessed the death of a child while on the job. And once again, such an incident proves that as much as advancements in technology have the capacity to enrich our lives, allowing us to stay in touch with people we're otherwise unable to see, it also has the capacity to darken them, too. Remember when the quarantine first started, and everyone was using Zoom for everything from work meetings to virtual birthday parties? Let me tell you, a lot of people weren't using passwords on their rooms, and if they were, the number of times that it was a 123 or a password was astounding. Point being, I broke into a whole lot of Zoom calls last summer, mostly with hilarious results. I hacked my way into some regional management meeting and told the exec he was fired. I got into what I figured was a remote learning session for a middle school where I successfully pretended to be a kid for like 15 minutes. I also caught some grandpa waiting for a call from a relative and almost convinced the guy that I was his grandson. Guy had to squint at the screen before telling me to go F myself. Okay, it was super obnoxious of me and I know I'm a jerk for doing it. But does it warm the cockles of your heart to know that I got my comeuppance? That I got what I deserve for sticking my dumb head where it didn't belong? I bet you are, even if it's just a little. But let's just see if that changes by the end of this story. So right after I had gotten into some afternoon mothers' meeting to give them all the sad little Life Jane speech from Come Dine With Me, I figured I'd peaked. There was nowhere to go, no more mountains to climb, so I gave Zoom sniping a rest for a bit until the cravings returned to me later that evening. The fun thing about Zoom sniping at night was that you occasionally found something a bit saucier than you would in the daytime. For example, I once got into a Zoom call between a few girls having a virtual sleepover in various states of undress. I'm not saying I stayed longer than a few seconds. I'm not that much of a perv, but you get my point. So I'm typing in random words in the search bar to bring up potential sniping targets. I accidentally hit a punctuation mark and happened across a room with a very distinctive name. Most are just called like Andy's Room or Queen's Park Regional Subway Managers Meeting, boring stuff like that. But this room didn't even have a name. It just had a series of punctuation that made up a kind of shape, like a kind of curve or wave shape. Usually I had a plan of what I was going to do before I got into a call, a goof or a bit that I had in mind. But that time I didn't. That time I just had this nagging curiosity to see what was going on in it. But you know what they say about curiosity, right? Instant regret. When I loaded into the call and saw what was happening on 2 of the 4 panels, I immediately exited the call. It was like a gut reaction, almost like a physical reaction to being burned by something. Like I legit shouted, "Whoa," and backed up from the keyboard before my hand jumped to the mouse. Then I just sat there kind of dumbstruck, just processing what I'd seen. I don't want to go into what it was. I don't think I have the words or the emotional capacity to go into detail regarding what I saw that night. But put it this way. Imagine the sweetest, most innocent-looking child you've ever seen. Now imagine the worst possible thing you could do to them. The worst thing you could ever possibly conceive of. Whatever it is, you'd rather see it happening to the kid than what I actually saw for real. It absolutely positively fried my brain for about 30 minutes, because that's about how long it took for me to realize I should have called the cops. As much as the concept filled me with dread, I actually set about trying to find the room again. I had to at least try to jot down some details, backgrounds, physical descriptions, anything that I'd be able to hand over to the police to aid them in arresting the scumbags responsible for what I can only describe as ritualistic abuse. I wasn't even sure which piece of punctuation I'd punched in erroneously, but you can bet I tried every single one in my attempt to find that godforsaken room again. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find it. I wasn't even sure what I could do at that point. I didn't think I could just call the police and be like, "I saw some kid getting messed with online, but I have 0 details." But apparently that's exactly what you're supposed to do. From what I found out over the next few days, after talking to a few Greater Manchester police officers, just telling the police what platform you see something dodgy on can help them pin down the people perpetrating the abuse. I didn't mean for this to turn into some internet safety infomercial. There was just so much I didn't know about how the police track down and remove that kind of indecent online material. We hear about stuff like that, and it all seems too abstract, like it's happening someplace else far, far away. But seeing it online like that, hiding in plain sight, it made me realize how kids are suffering like that every single day, all over the world, and we're not doing nearly enough as a society to stop it. But anyway, The point is, just be careful when you're snooping around online. You might just bite off considerably more than you can chew. That, and if you do see something, always report it. It might seem pointless, but just know your actions bring us all one step closer to ridding the world of dangerous predators. It all started with a Zoom call. At least, I only became aware it was happening because of a Zoom call. For all I know, it could have been happening for much longer, but the day of the second post-lockdown work meeting was the first time I noticed it. We're in the middle of a pretty tedious brainstorming session with a few members of marketing when a coworker interrupts whoever's talking to address me by name. It actually made me jump at first. I was totally tuned out, so hearing my name brought me right back around again. I respond, "Huh? Yep, I was listening." When I notice the person who addressed me is now closely studying their own laptop screen. "I don't mean to alarm you," they said, "but I think someone's watching you through the window behind you." I know exactly which window he's talking about, so I turn, a bit nervous at the idea of discovering he's right, only to see that there's no one there. I'm more relieved than anything, to be honest. I figured he was playing a joke on me because he clocked that I was nodding off during the meeting, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't maybe deserve it a little bit. "Very funny," I said, and a few of the other callers had a little titter at the impromptu prank. "I'm sorry, but I wasn't joking," the guy said. "Did no one else see that? I'm so sure." You're probably just seeing things," someone else chimed in, and within a few minutes, the whole thing was completely forgotten. A smudge on the screen, a bit of lag on the call, eyes playing tricks. There were 100 ways to explain it. The truth was literally unthinkable at that stage. A short while later, the exact same thing happens. The same guy interrupts, only far more urgently this time, saying, Look, it's right there. I'm not imagining it. You can all see that, yeah?" I know what he's talking about, only I don't turn around immediately. I look at my own webcam feed to see what he was talking about, and right when I see it, what's clearly the silhouette of a head in the window behind me, I hear one of the other callers say "Oh, wow, I see it too." I spin around just in time to catch the quick blur of whoever was watching me, ducking out of view. I'm actually really creeped out at this point because it obviously wasn't just somebody walking past my ground floor bedroom. Someone had actually stopped to stare inside. My window isn't even facing the street. It's at the side of the apartment block, like you have to actually go out of your way to find it. Now, I'm only 5'3" and I'm 8 stone, which for any Americans reading this means I'm tiny. And I had to make sure if someone was actually creeping on me, they weren't just hiding out and waiting until I was vulnerable. So, phone in one hand, kitchen knife in the other, I tell the Zoom call that I'll be right back and then head out to make sure that everything is kosher. It's peak lockdown during all of this, so the streets are pretty much deserted, so I'd think I'd have noticed anyone wandering around. But there was no one, not a soul in sight. So I guessed, or rather hoped, that it was just some neighbor kids messing around, maybe looking for a wayward ball or something. About a week goes by and the whole window face incident has been at the back of my mind the whole time. For a lot of young women who live alone, the idea of being targeted where we're most vulnerable is frankly terrifying. So the prospect of that nightmare coming to life just didn't bear thinking about. I'm not saying I was on edge the whole time or that I lose sleep over it or anything, but let's just say I held my keys a little tighter in my fists whenever I walk down the street my apartment block is on. But anyway, at one point I head out to the grocery store to pick up food and I ended up caught in one of those super long COVID lines that you're stuck in for like 40 minutes before you're allowed into the store to buy your stuff. This is on top of the fact that the store near me had implemented this dumb one-way system in the aisles in an attempt to stop the spread. My point is, a trip that would have normally taken like half hour ends up taking more like 90 minutes, and an annoying amount of my day has been completely wasted. So I'm already in a bad mood by the time I get back to my apartment, only to find that the front door has been bashed in. Apparently, there had been a break-in while I was out. If only criminals could work from home. It seemed obvious that it was a burglary at first. All my stuff had been strewn around, drawers and cabinets were opened and emptied. The TV was still there, along with my PlayStation, but most break-ins just go for jewelry and phones, I heard. Anything small that they can pawn easily. Obviously, I called the cops like there and then, who arrived within a half hour or so. They advised me to help them look around the apartment for anything that might be missing, valuable electronics and whatnot, but I told them I already looked and that nothing obvious seemed to have been taken. My bedroom looked like it had been hit by a bomb. Clothes had been strewn all over the place. Whole drawers had been pulled out and flipped, like whoever broke in was looking for something. One of the cops spent some time looking around in there before he called out to his partner. "Hey, we need forensics up in here," is what he actually said. I asked him what the deal was, if he'd found something that I should know about. Both cops had been warm, friendly, and helpful up until that point, but when I asked him why forensics was needed, one of them told me not to worry about it and to stay out of my bedroom for the time being. It was no big deal at first. I was just grateful that they showed up so fast, even if they did wear masks and insist on keeping 6 feet between us at all times. So by the time forensics team showed up, I'm out front of my apartment building talking to my mom on the phone. Only when I see what they're actually doing in my apartment, it triggers what I can only describe as a mini freakout. Guys in gloves and white coverall suits have been scooping big handfuls of my underwear into bags, sealing them, then taking them out to their truck outside. And then it dawns on me, whoever broke into my apartment had left DNA on my underwear. Now, I probably don't need to tell you how exactly they'd done that. The whole thing grosses me out too much for me to actually type it. But the thing that really got to me was, if I'd actually been home that afternoon, there's no telling what would have happened if some violent perv had actually gotten their dirty hands on me. But anyway, the story does actually have something of a resolution and thankfully a happy ending, because they had this guy's DNA. Police were able to match it on their database with a guy who'd had multiple run-ins with the law for public exposure, among other things. He was arrested, and he's now looking at 3 years in prison for aggravated burglary, some kind of charge like that. But the whole thing came full circle for me in an interview with some detective who'd mentioned that this guy liked casing his victims' places before he struck. "Over the past month or so, have you seen anyone hanging around your apartment who doesn't live there, maybe someone looking through your window?" He said it. He literally said it. It was him, that day when I was in the Zoom call. It was him that had been looking through my window. He'd been stalking me for God knows how long, and when it came for him to actually get me, only by the grace of God was I lucky enough to have been out grocery shopping. Otherwise, it doesn't bear thinking about what might have happened.